In the spring of 1200 BC, a 9-year-old girl stood inside the courtyard of the Temple of Amun at Karnak, while priests shaved her head to bare skin. Her name was Nefertari. 3 days earlier, her father brought her here because he could not repay a debt. Grain was gone, silver was gone, so he paid with his child. She was told this was an honor, service to the gods, a life of meaning. But when the razor cut through her hair, she cried. An older priestess struck her face and told her servants of the god, "Do not cry." In that moment, Nefertari learned something simple and permanent. She no longer belonged to herself. From that day forward, her life followed a path already carved by thousands before her. Egyptian temples were not places of quiet prayer. They were engines of power. They owned land, herds, workshops, and fleets of boats. They lent grain and silver. They enforced contracts. When people failed to pay, the temples collected in flesh. Girls like Nefertari were called servants of the god, wives of the god, hands of the goddess. The titles sounded elevated. They were designed to. Language softened what was happening. But the reality was simple. These girls were property. Most never chose this life. Many were given to the temples as children, sometimes as offerings, meant to secure divine favor, sometimes because a family had too many mouths to feed. Others were delivered as debt payment, recorded in ledgers alongside livestock and tools. Temples accepted them, the same way they accepted grain. Then there were the girls taken by force. Egyptian armies returned from Nubia, Libya, and the Levant with captives. Among them were children. Papyri list them as tribute. Gold, cattle, linen, and girls. Once handed over to the temples, their identities vanished into religious bureaucracy. The ages were young. 8, 10. Before puberty, before consent meant anything, children incapable of understanding what lifelong service meant. One of them was a Nubian girl named Mutamua. She was 8 when soldiers came to her village. She did not speak Egyptian. She did not know the gods they claimed to serve. She was tied to other children with rope and marched north for weeks. When she cried, she was beaten. That was her first lesson. At Thebes, she was assigned to the Temple of Mut, a goddess associated with motherhood. The irony mattered to no one. From that moment, Mutamua would never be allowed to become a mother herself. The transformation process was deliberate. Nothing was accidental. The first ritual was purification by water. The girl was stripped and washed in pools mixed with natron salt. Officially, this was cleansing. In practice, it was inspection. Priests examined every part of the body, while older women held the child still. Resistance was framed as disobedience to the gods. Nefertari learned very quickly that fear was safer than protest. After the baths came the shaving. Every strand of hair removed carried identity. Family styles, regional customs, cutting it erased those ties. When Nefertari looked into a bronze mirror, she no longer recognized herself. That was the point. Then came renaming. Her birth name was forbidden. Names connected a person to lineage and memory. The temple severed both. Nefertari became Nefert Nebet. Beautiful is the lady, a name chosen for her, not by her. That renaming marked a symbolic death. Her old self was gone. In temple records, she now existed only as a function. The final step was the so, called divine marriage. The child was dressed in linen, adorned with jewelry, and brought before the statue of the god. She repeated vows written by priests. My body is the god's temple. My life is the god's property. The words were binding. Once spoken, there was no exit. What followed was not spiritual. It was legal ownership disguised as holiness. Life inside the temple settled into a rhythm meant to erase resistance. Days began before sunrise. Dozens of girls slept together in shared rooms under constant supervision. There was no privacy. There was no silence that belonged to you. Even sleep was monitored. Morning purification came first. Washing was mandatory. Linen robes followed. White cloth marked ownership. After that came labor, grinding grain until hands bled. Weaving cloth for hours without pause, scrubbing stone floors already clean. Everything was framed as service. None of it was optional. The hardest part was not the work. It was the silence. Speaking without permission brought punishment. Silence prevented trust. It isolated each woman inside her own thoughts. You could stand beside someone every day and still feel completely alone. Nefertari worked at the looms next to a girl named Takiyat. They were close in the only way allowed, exchanging brief whispers when no one was watching. One afternoon, they were heard. The overseer struck Takiyat with a wooden staff and dragged her away in front of everyone. She was gone for 3 days. When she returned, she never spoke again. 2 months later, her place at the loom was empty. The temple said she had been found impure and returned to the gods. No one asked what that meant. Surveillance never stopped. The women were watched as they worked, as they ate, as they slept. Regular purity inspections continued. These were performed by priests. They were invasive. They were humiliating. Resistance brought punishment. Nefertari learned how to leave her body during them, to let her mind drift somewhere unreachable. Education reinforced obedience. The women were taught that priests spoke with divine authority, that their bodies were sacred vessels. That suffering was proof of worth. The logic was simple and cruel. If your body belonged to the god, and the priests acted for the god, then refusal was impossible. Mutamur struggled longer than most. She remembered her mother's voice one night. She hummed a Nubian song under her breath. She was reported immediately. The next morning, the high priest told her she had no mother, no language, no past. She was locked in a storage room for 7 days. When she emerged, she never sang again. By then, both girls understood the truth. The temple was not preparing them for a divine life. It was training them to endure. Among the women inside the temple, there was a smaller group, marked for something, called sacred service. They were given a title that translated to wives of the god. The name sounded elevated. It was meant to. In reality, it placed them closer to the priests and farther from safety. These women were selected young. Beauty mattered. Obedience mattered more. They were told they had been chosen for a rare honor to take part in rituals that sustained the balance of the world. The ceremonies were described in temple texts as sacred unions, symbolic reenactments of divine myths, meant to ensure fertility and order. The words were careful. The reality was not high. Ranking priests claimed that during these rituals, they became living vessels of the god. They wore masks. They spoke in ritual language. They declared that the god acted through them. What they did next was framed as divine will. When Nefertari was chosen for her first sacred union, she was 14. She had been conditioned for years to obey, to remain silent, to believe resistance was sin. On the night of the ritual, she was bathed, dressed in fine linen, and led into the inner sanctuary. Incense filled the air. The doors closed behind her. The high priest told her the god would bless her. When she did not understand what he meant, he reached for her robes. She stepped back. Other priests spoke softly, telling her fear was natural, that submission was proof of devotion. They warned her that refusal would insult the god and bring disaster upon Egypt. What followed was recorded as a successful ritual. For Nefertari was her first understanding that holiness was a word used to erase violence. These ceremonies were not rare. Some women were subjected to them repeatedly. The system depended on silence and belief. The women had been taught since childhood that their bodies were not their own. The priests depended on that lesson. Sometimes, women became pregnant. The temple never denied this. Instead, it absorbed it. Children born from these rituals were declared blessed. Sons were raised within the priesthood. Daughters were trained for service, just like their mothers. The cycle closed neatly. When Nefertari realized she was pregnant, she was moved to a separate area where other expectant women lived. No one spoke about how the pregnancies happened. Everyone understood. An older woman told her not to hope. Once the child was weaned, it would be taken. If it was a girl, she would return to the same dormitories. If a boy, the priests would claim him. Nefertari gave birth to a daughter. For 3 years, she was allowed to care for her. 3 years of whispered songs, stolen moments, and fear. Then the child was taken away to begin purification training. Nefertari returned to her duties. She was forbidden to acknowledge her daughter. When they passed in the corridors, watching the same process begin again was a punishment the temple never named. Not everyone endured in silence. A few resisted openly. The consequences were public and brutal. One punishment was called dedication to the desert. The woman was taken beyond the temple walls and left without food or water. Death came slowly. The message was meant to be unforgettable. One woman, Renatma, shouted during a meal that the priests were not gods, and the temple was a prison. She was dragged outside. Every woman was forced to watch as she was abandoned in the desert. The next morning, they were shown her remains. The priest called it purification. After that, resistance changed shape. It became quiet, invisible. Small acts only the women could recognize. A deliberate error woven into cloth. A glance held too long during prayer. Scratched words, hidden where no priest would look. Most of the women died inside those walls. When they were buried, there were no markers, no names, just pits beside the temple foundations. The stones remained clean. The suffering stayed hidden. By the time Nefertari reached her 30s, time inside the temple had lost shape. Days did not move forward, they repeated. Labor, silence, inspection, obedience. Years passed without markers. Birthdays were meaningless. The only way to measure time was by watching new children arrive and old women disappear. The older attendants were living warnings. Women who had spent 40 or 50 years inside the system moved slowly, their bodies worn down by work and neglect. Some spoke only when ordered. Others no longer spoke at all. They were used to train the younger girls, repeating the same rules that had broken them. Endure. Forget. Illness was common. Exhaustion was constant. Care was minimal. A woman who could still work was kept alive. A woman who could not was considered spent. The temple recorded deaths without ceremony. Names were scratched out of ledgers. The work continued the next day. Nefertari saw women disappear after inspections. Sometimes the reason given was impurity. Sometimes there was no reason at all. Everyone understood that impurity did not mean dirt or illness. It meant defiance, sadness, memory, or simply being noticed in the wrong way by the wrong priest. Mutimur survived longer than most. She learned how to become invisible. She kept her eyes lowered, her movements precise. She carried her memories carefully, hidden where no one could reach them. At night, she repeated her mother's name silently, so it would not disappear. That was the quiet rebellion most women practiced. Memory itself became an act of resistance. Occasionally, fragments of that resistance surfaced. In storage rooms, faint carvings appeared behind jars and crates. Short sentences scratched into stone. I was born free. Remember me. They were small, easy to miss, enough to remind someone else that they were not alone. Nefertari added her own mark once, late at night, using a broken pin. She carved a single line near the floor, where no one would look. My name was not always this. It took hours. Her hands shook the entire time. As she aged, her body hardened. Fear dulled into something flatter, not acceptance. Something closer to endurance. She stopped hoping for escape. Escape required somewhere to go. The temple had taken that long ago. Her daughter grew into her role quickly. Nefertari watched from a distance as the same rituals began. The shaving, the baths, the renaming. She was not allowed to intervene. Not allowed to speak. When their eyes met across a courtyard once, only once, Nefertari looked away first. She knew what attention could cost. Death came quietly. Nefertari collapsed during work one afternoon. She was carried out, not to be treated, but to be removed. She died before nightfall. There was no ceremony, no words spoken in her name. Her body was placed in a pit with 3 others. No coffin, no marker. The temple recorded her death as a loss of labor. Nothing more. Mutamua lived longer. 2 days before her death, she scratched words into a wall inside a dark chamber rarely used. She wrote of her homeland. Beyond the first cataract, she wrote her mother's name. She wrote that she remembered. That was her final act. The temples still stand. Their walls are covered in scenes of gods, kings, and order. Visitors walk through them in silence, admiring the scale, the symmetry, the beauty. They rarely imagine the lives spent inside those walls, the children taken, the women broken slowly and efficiently. But the stones remember. Not because they were meant to, because someone forced them to. These women were not symbols. They were people. They lived. They suffered. They resisted in the only ways left to them. History did not erase them completely. It only tried. What makes this system difficult to confront is not that it was chaotic or hidden. It was orderly. It was documented. It functioned because it fit perfectly inside Egypt's religious and economic structure. Temples justified everything through language. Control became purity. Ownership became devotion. Abuse became ritual. Once those words were accepted, the system no longer looked violent. It looked necessary. The priests did not need chains. They had belief. The women had been taught, since childhood, that resistance endangered the world itself, that if the gods were displeased, the Nile would fail, crops would die, Egypt would collapse. Disobedience was framed as mass murder. Silence became a moral duty. This is why the system endured for centuries. The women were isolated from family, stripped of memory, denied legitimate children, and kept economically dependent. Even if one escaped the walls, she would have nowhere to go. No name, no home, no legal status. The temple had already erased her existence outside its control. Death did not free them. Burial practices erased them completely. No tombs, no offerings, no inscriptions. Egyptian culture obsessed over the afterlife, yet denied these women even that dignity. To remember them would be to admit what the temples truly were. And yet, memory survived anyway. Not in official records, not in grand monuments, but in scratches hidden behind storage jars, in weaving floors only another woman would recognize, in names carved too low on walls for priests to notice. These were not accidents. They were acts of defiance by people who understood that being remembered was the last form of freedom left to them. When modern visitors walk through these temples, they see gods frozen in stone. They see kings offering order to the universe. What they do not see are the systems that fed on children to keep that image intact. Nefertari was not unique. Mutamua was not rare. Thousands lived and died the same way. Their lives were not mistakes or deviations. They were the cost of maintaining religious power. This is not a story about ancient cruelty alone. It is a reminder of how easily authority cloaks itself in holiness. Institutions rewrite violence as duty. How systems survive not by force alone, but by shaping what people believe is normal. necessary, and sacred. The temples were beautiful. They still are. That is what makes the truth harder to look at. There is a reason these stories feel distant. Distance makes them safer. Stone and time soften what happened inside those walls. It becomes architecture. It becomes history. It stops being people. But if you listen closely, the distance collapses. A 9-year-old girl crying as her hair is shaved away. A child repeating vows she cannot understand. A woman watching her daughter disappear into the same system that consumed her. These are not symbols. They are lived experiences, recorded quietly, where power did not expect anyone to look. The temples wanted eternity. They achieved it through silence, yet silence never fully held. Somewhere behind the carved scenes of gods and kings, a woman scratched her name. Another carved her mother's. Another wrote that she had been free once. These were not pleas for rescue. They were refusals to vanish. That is what survives. When you stand in those temples today, you are standing inside a machine that worked exactly as intended. Beauty on the surface, order in stone, and beneath it, lives spent to keep that image intact. Remembering them does not destroy history, it completes it. They were heard. They left proof. Now, you know where to look.